Here's a story where all of the facts are correct, and it doesn't tell the truth, but it's a good story. At the age of 50, having volunteered as an army chaplain in World War II, the Reverend Louis McGee lay awake on an army cot in Belgium, listening to the sound of bombers flying above him. And something shifted inside him in that moment, in that place. Something resolved itself. You know that feeling when something inside you shifts. You know where you're going or what you're going to do, even if you don't quite know how to get there. And it was this: after the war, he became a Unitarian minister, and as a black man founded a black humanist congregation in Chicago. And then in time became the first black man called as the senior minister of a white church in our tradition. Every one of those facts is correct. That's accurate. There's nothing wrong in what I've said. But it doesn't really tell the true story. It's a simple story that I just gave you, where integration was inevitable, and with delight, we white folks made a home for black folks and championed and supported the guts and gumption of a driven man. Let's take that whole thing one more time. Let's tell the truth about it a little more. Louis McGee, a black man, the son of a former slave, had, by the time he enlisted as a chaplain, had for 20 years served in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, people he loved dearly, and a theology he did not believe in. Some of you all ended up as Unitarians for that same combination of reasons. McGee was a humanist. You heard his theology in the call to worship, the opening words. That's him describing his theology. He was a member of the governing board of the American Humanist Association while still serving an AME church. But when, in the years before World War II, he asked the American Unitarian Association about ordination as a Unitarian, I should say, as the Unitarian that he clearly was, their guidance, their response back to him was regretful and sympathetic and basically uninterested. They said if he wanted to be a Unitarian minister, well, he'd have to gather a congregation of black folks to be the minister of. As they told another black aspirant to ministry while denying him fellowship in the 40s, they wrote, "Look, we share the conviction that we ought to be doing more in the field of ministry to black people than we are now. We share also the conviction that an interracial church was something that ought to be established. We feel, however," they wrote, "we feel that since there is no opportunity for a black man to find a church among us, it's not right that we should fellowship him as a minister and then have no work for him to do." That's what racism looks like too. That's what white supremacy looks like. Not open race hatred, but the regretful, the almost wistful, apologetic declaration, "Gee whiz, we sure wish the world was different. And wouldn't it be nice if someone would change it? But, it's not our fault. The way things are is the way things are, and we all have to live in this world, so what are you going to do?" McGee, on a cot in Belgium with the sound of bombers flying overhead, resolved that he was going to make a way where there was no way. And after he returned home at the end of the war, he made big changes, says one biographer, understating it somewhat. He married Marcella Walker, the daughter of a well-to-do Chicago African-American family, and he entered Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago and began his studies for Unitarian ministry. And after graduation, the two of them together, Louis and Marcella, charted a new course. They were convinced that there was a hunger for liberal religion, for humanism, for Unitarianism among Black folks on Chicago's South Side. And they started the Free Religious Fellowship and gathered a congregation and grew it from nothing to 100 members. Mostly Black folks, but some white folks, some Japanese. The Free Religious Fellowship was supported and encouraged, once it was launched and gaining traction, by other leaders in Chicago and nationally. After a few years, he moved on to a new challenge. He went to Flint, Michigan, a congregation looking for a minister, and impressed them preaching in 1957. But when the time came for them to vote him in, he didn't get 2/3 that was needed to be called. 2 years later, he became the assistant minister at First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles. And finally, in 1961, 40 years after he first explored and hoped for ministry, he became the minister of the Chico Unitarian Fellowship, the first Black man called as the senior minister of a mostly white congregation in this denomination, 1961. So it's not that the first version of this story is wrong exactly, right? McGee, the hero, the champion, bravely opening new roads and breaking down barriers. He did that. But it doesn't really tell the truth of the whole story. The truth of it is a lot more complicated. Those mid-century Unitarians supporting and cheering him on into leadership are also the villains, setting the barriers and obstacles, and always obscuring their racism inside of reasonable, well-meaning, decent-sounding arguments. Our religious history when it comes to race is complicated. In 1785, one of the members of the very first Universalist church in America was a Black man. A century later, 4 of the secret 6 who financed John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, 4 of the 6 of them were Unitarians. Unitarians were abolitionists, their houses were stops on the Underground Railroad, and we are deluding ourselves if we pretend that's the whole story. It was the Unitarian Senator John Calhoun who pushed through the Fugitive Slave Act, and it was the Unitarian President, Millard Fillmore, who signed it, writing, "God knows I detest slavery, but we must endure it and give it such protection as is guaranteed by the Constitution till we can get rid of it without destroying the last hope of free government in the world." This is one of the ways that racism works in this country. A social order that values white people more than people of color doesn't maintain that hierarchy just through open hatred. It maintains it by making good, sensible, reasonable arguments that let the people in power believe there is no other way it could be, that let them believe we're the good guys, surely. This is the shape of the racist backlash to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Listen, the anti-DEI crowd says. It's white people who have it hard right now. We're being made to feel bad and guilty about something outside of our control. We didn't do this. We didn't create this. Listen, they say. DEI secretly means that white folks are all racists, and our history, whatever it may have been, is punishing us now in the present. And since none of us are, of course, the villain, that version of history must not be true. Through that lens, the fact that a person of color holds a senior position is all the proof that you need that they're not entitled to it. For surely they must only have it because the scales were tipped in their favor. It's difficult to say all of this without just dripping in sarcasm, but this is the shape of the argument that's made. On Friday, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with a 40-year military career, a fighter pilot, a 4-star general, was fired, and our defense secretary, writing of the chairman's promotion to general, asked, was it because of his skin color? He's a black man. Was it because of his skin color or his skill? We'll never know, but always doubt, which on its face seems unfair. But since he has made the race card one of his biggest calling cards, it doesn't really matter much. That is to say, the fact that a person of color holds a role of power is proof that they shouldn't hold it. Because being black means you're always playing the race card. A white person will always be at a disadvantage to them. This is the utterly upside down, absurd logic. But the point of walking through that is not just like to raise our collective blood pressure. I feel that in the room right now. The point of walking through that is to say that just like the Ministerial Fellowship Committee in the 1940s, systemic racism keeps control, keeps the status quo, keeps the hierarchy in place by hiding between and behind arguments that try to sound sensible. Logic and calm, rational analysis disguise white supremacy. And a country, a religious tradition, for that matter, a life, our individual lives, built on that sort of historical amnesia is built on sand. And our work is, first of all, to face the complexity of this in our country, our denomination, in our own lives, to face the fact that our people, our history, our ancestors were not all good or all bad. They were complicated. So are we. All of us can resist the simple stories that enable oppression. And all of us can also go along with them too and ignore the inconvenient parts of our own pasts or others. Any of us can get mired in a sinkhole of guilt or shame that keeps us looking in instead of paying attention to the world. What's the story then? What's the story we're going to tell ourselves about who we are? My mother told me that when she was 12 years old, her grandfather told her the stories his father had told him of fighting in the Civil War. This was my great-great-grandfather, Henry Charles Stevens, who had a twin brother named Charles Henry Stevens. I don't know if their parents had a good sense of humor or a very short list of names. But Henry Charles and Charles Henry, they enlisted together on a Monday, April 22nd, 1861. They mustered into Pennsylvania's 35th Infantry, and they fought Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg. Henry Charles was part of the company that held Little Round Top. He survived 3 years of it and came home and got married. And the ring his wife wore then is what's on Terry's finger today. The past is not long ago. And I said that once to my mother, who's an avid historian, and she said, yeah, you feel that way because you're getting old. Which is also true. What I would like very much, on some level, is for what I just told you to be the whole story of my ancestors in the Civil War. I would like it to be that simple and that clear-cut. We were the good guys. Another branch of my mom's family was in South Carolina. James McMahon married Lucinda Taylor. James turned 17 years old in 1861. And while I don't have the primary source that shows it, I know what a 17-year-old white man in South Carolina did in 1861. He went to fight for the Confederacy. And more than that, his wife, Lucinda Taylor's family, gave their name to the town of Taylors, South Carolina. It's outside Greenville. Families who gave their names to towns in South Carolina in the 1800s were slave owners. My people were not just the good guys. The story is not that simple, and that is just like one little branch of the family tree. This sort of complexity, this is the story of our own families. It's the story of this religious tradition. It's the story of our country, too. There's no unambiguous heroes and unambiguous villains. We're actual people, complicated, and our work is to engage with that and face that and then stay human in an inhumane world, to hold the complexity of all of those parts and then decide what to do with it. I sat down once with Louis McGee's granddaughter. Liz Harris was a member of the congregation I served back then. She was the treasurer. But I wanted to know about her grandfather that day. Liz was well into her 70s then. She had a sharper mind than I will ever have. She had an effortless elegance. She had run an art gallery for years, among so many other things. And we sat there in this old church building. She was wearing a back brace she hated, recovering from surgery. And she smiled, and her eyes softened. And she told me stories not about her grandfather's resume, but about his character. My grandfather, she said, my grandfather, Louis McGee, and my grandmother, they were the people every child needs in their life. People who will protect you and support you and love you. She said he was quiet and steady. He would laugh at the "a little dab will do you" commercials when he'd watch TV and drink his cocktail before dinner. He was of a generation of men who did not talk about their feelings. Liz said you could fish with him for hours, and about the most he would say was "pass the worms." But you knew he was with you and for you. She told me that as a fifth grader bullied by the other children, her grandfather told her, "You're fortunate, and you need to understand that you're fortunate. And that requires you to be responsible. The kids are jealous of you, jealous that you sit at the honors table, jealous of your family. They're not angry at you. They're angry at the way things are." And when I heard her say that, I wondered if the advice he gave her was the same advice he was living by. I wondered sometimes if that was the path he followed to stay human in an inhumane world. After all, he knew the complexity of what it really meant when Unitarians claimed with pride our president, Fillmore. He knew what it really meant when we named churches after Thomas Jefferson. And perhaps he could have said, "I'm not angry at the people. I'm angry at the way things are. I'm angry at the way we don't even see what's right in front of us. I'm angry at the simple stories. Not naive, not resigned, not cynical, but facing the fullness of the world and doing the work he was called into." What do Unitarians believe? He said, we believe in the creative power of love or goodwill in family and social relationships. We believe in things beautiful as well as good and true. We believe in the supreme value of the human person. And maybe most of all, most importantly of all, we believe in action that puts into daily practice these beliefs. We don't think justice is inevitable. We don't think things are inevitably getting better. We're choosing to live in the world and work for that. We don't think that everyone automatically does the right thing and we're all good all the time. We're people choosing to put love at the center of our lives, and then with a big sigh say, okay, well, what does that mean now for what we got to do with ourselves? Our call is not to be perfect, not to be the heroes of our stories, but to be human, not to be blameless and pure and correct and aggrieved, but to tell the whole truth, to go looking for the whole truth, to be hungry for the uncomfortable territory of what really happened in your life. Where did your people really come from and through and into? The truth that's not simple or one-sided or easy. In a world that wants you disengaged, overwhelmed, enraged, this is an act of integrity and of resistance to be a people who face and hold complexity. It's hard work and it's holy work. Amen.